Loss and damage is both the physical effects of the climate emergency, and we see that really in two forms. One is the physical impacts: sea level rise, glacial melt, forest fires, floods around the world, which are a result of either irreversible impact, i.e. climate change has got to the point where we can't do anything to reverse the consequences, sea level rise being a good example. But there's lots of loss and damage happening which is avoidable, but we're not adapting to climate change, so those losses are occurring. So that's the physical manifestation of loss and damage. We've then also got the political process, the capital loss and damage that's talked about in the negotiating halls, which is really about trying to come up with a solution to the physical attributes that are impacting developing countries, particularly around the world. Loss and damage has been an aspect of the climate negotiations from the very outset. It was first proposed in 1991 by AUSIS, and they were talking about developing some sort of global mutual fund that would support countries who would face impacts of climate change. It was very much about something that could be avoided if we acted then, in the 90s. Loss and damage has been grown in importance because we failed to mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions. We failed to implement adaptation at scale necessary, and we're seeing not only in developing countries but also in the developed world the consequences of that inaction. The flood, the wildfires, the drought. So I think loss and damage is now recognised as a global phenomenon. It can hit anybody at any time, and we need to start doing something about it. So it's finally on the agenda here at COP27. We're not going to stop earthquakes, we're not going to stop civil political unrest creating humanitarian emergencies. In the past, 20, 30 years ago, then the humanitarian system was also responding to mega floods and mega cyclones. But where we are now is we're at a point where, because of inaction on climate change, because of failure to mitigate pollution from fossil fuels, we're getting these floods happening more frequently, affecting more people, and therefore we need a special mechanism to support those people. It's not about expanding the humanitarian system, which has already got a very full mandate, is already under-resourced. We need new and additional sources of resourcing to meet those needs which are currently not covered by the humanitarian system. To finance those responses to address loss and damage, we need new and additional sources of funding. It's not a case of what we've seen so far, which is taking money from official development assistance or from adaptation and relabelling it as loss and damage finance. The scale of the problem means we need new and additional sources, so we've got to think outside the box. And there are ideas out there such as an aviation levy, such as a tax on fossil fuel extraction, which could be used to generate quite significant amounts of money. We could also go a long way by reversing the subsidies that the fossil fuel and associated industries receive at the global level, the plastics industry, the fertiliser industry, which are fossil fuel industries in themselves. By reversing those subsidies and applying them to address loss and damage, we could go a long way to filling the gaps that are currently being experienced. Loss and damage support is needed the most in the most climate vulnerable countries, and those are the countries where either the physical impacts of climate change are so severe that they have an existential threat, and I'm talking there about the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean Islands, the small island developing states. They have a real challenge that they're losing their territory, and if we don't reverse sea level rise, we don't reverse global warming and then start to tackle sea level rise, they face an existential threat to their future. So they would be the number one priority, and then I think the second up priority order would be least developed countries where the impacts of climate change are having a really significant impact in their ability to develop. It's diverting resources and efforts away from education, from health, from infrastructure, to literally patching up after each disaster happens. Yes, I think developed countries have a responsibility. When the convention was initially negotiated, it was a global convention because this is a global problem. It's about pollution, it's about CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, and it's about the fact that there is a finite amount of CO2 that we can pump into the atmosphere before climate change becomes irreversible and the impacts are severe. So there is a moral responsibility for the developed world to support the developing world for impacts that they are not responsible for. Most developing countries contribute less than 1% to the global greenhouse gas emissions, and the vast majority of those emissions are due to developed countries, but also to the fossil fuel industries. We've got to highlight those polluting industries, because if we don't, we're not going to solve this problem, because it's not just about CO2 emissions, it's also about water pollution and other forms of pollution. So we need a polluter pays mechanism really to be implemented, and the developed countries have got to lead on that type of transformation of the global economic system.